Hello, everyone, and welcome to our national panel discussion on the Renters' Bill of Rights. My name is Utaka Dirks with the Canadian Centre for Housing Rights, or CCHR. I'll be facilitating our discussion today. Ahead of National Housing Day, we're excited to host this event to shed light on what the Renters' Bill of Rights is, how it can be improved and implemented, how it can address systemic housing issues, and what renters and advocates like yourselves can do to ensure that it truly reflects your experiences and your needs. Thank you all for joining us today for this critical discussion. Next slide, please. To begin, I'd like to take some time to ground this event in recognition of the ongoing harms of colonization and to make a commitment to ground action towards decolonization and reconciliation. While CCHR is a national organization with staff living on the unceded traditional territories of many different Indigenous nations, I'm currently joining you from Toronto, which is located in the treaty lands and territories of the Mississauga of the Credit First Nation, as well as the traditional territory of the Chippewa, Haudenosaunee, and the Wendat peoples. These lands are now home to many diverse First Nations, Inuit, and Métis people. But I live in Winnipeg, in the traditional territories of the Anishinaabe, Innu, the Anishinaabe, the Dene, and the Dakota people, and also the birthplace and homeland of the Red River Métis Nation. In Winnipeg, we get our water from Shoal Lake 40 First Nation, a community who only recently got reliable, clean drinking water. In Winnipeg, our electricity comes from hydro dams, which flooded Indigenous territories north of the city. All across Canada, from wherever you're joining us today, our communities have been built and are shaped by similar histories of displacement and exploitation. As housing advocates, we need to recognize the direct connection between land dispossession, displacement, and the systemic racism that Indigenous peoples face, and the disproportionate rates of Indigenous poverty, housing precarity, and homelessness. As we dive into discussions today around how to hold governments accountable to upholding the right to housing, we must also uphold our duties as treaty people to recognize the inherent Indigenous right to self-determination and press our governments to do the same. At CCHR, we look forward to continuing to do this work closely with Indigenous-led organizations and advocates to advance human rights-based approaches to end the housing crisis. Next slide, please. And just a bit about CCHR, or the Canadian Centre for Housing Rights. We are a charitable organization working to advance the right to adequate housing across the country. CCHR has been doing this work for over 35 years, working at the intersection of human rights and housing. We provide free services to renters facing evictions and human rights violations so they can remain housed. We provide education and training about human rights across Canada, and we work to advance rights-based housing policy through research, policy development, advocacy, and law reform. Next slide. So today we're incredibly grateful to have a fantastic panel joining us to speak about a broad range of systemic housing issues and the Renters' Bill of Rights. We're pleased to welcome Tanya Burkhart from ACORN Canada, Nicoletta Bardelli from Spinal Cord Injury Ontario in the Accelerating Accessibility Coalition, Gael Busharamwi from the National Association of Friendship Centers, and Michelle Biss from the National Right to Housing Network. So those are our panelists, and we'll go from them in just a minute. Next slide. So this is a brief look at our agenda today. We'll begin with a brief overview of the Renters' Bill of Rights and why it matters. My colleague, Sarah Beyer, CCHR's Manager of Policy, will be taking that on. Then it'll be followed by a series of short presentations from each of our panelists on key systemic housing issues, including affordability and displacement, accessibility and cultural adequacy, Indigenous housing, and systemic discrimination and access to justice. So then we'll hear from all the panelists during a panel discussion. We'll get a chance to answer some questions and engage in a discussion together. And then which will be followed by a Q&A based on your questions that you're posing in the Q&A down at the bottom of the screen. So finally, after all of that, we'll close with our next steps and kind of actions that you can take and that we all hopefully can take to improve the situation facing renters across Canada. So with that, I'd like to hand it over to Sarah.
Thanks so much, Utaka, and thank you everyone for joining us today. We're really happy to have you. So what is the Renters' Bill of Rights and why does it matter? The Renters' Bill of Rights is a blueprint or policy statement from the federal government that aims to support fair and well-functioning renting systems across Canada. The government says that the blueprint outlines its policy objectives to build a national consensus to protect renters, which includes 4 key principles: ensuring everyone has a safe and affordable place to call home, fostering fairness and transparency, addressing inequity and discrimination, and safeguarding the rental housing system. We'll get into more of the context of the blueprint and its limitations shortly. Next slide, please. So the Renters' Bill of Rights was first announced by the federal government just ahead of the 2024 budget and their new Canada Housing Plan. While few details were released at the time, we saw this as a critical opportunity to address the housing crisis by establishing national standards for renter protections. Currently, renter protections are very uneven across the country, and in some provinces and territories, renters have little to no protections from massive rent increases, unfair evictions, discrimination, and many other issues. Over the summer, we brought together a group of housing organizations and tenant groups and worked closely with the federal housing minister's office as they were developing the Renters' Bill of Rights. Unfortunately, there were limited opportunities for broader public consultations at that time. The federal government wanted to develop the Renters' Bill of Rights fairly quickly in order to bring it to negotiations with the provinces and territories as a condition for them to access new infrastructure funding. This is an important piece of the puzzle, as most landlord and tenant matters are governed by provincial and territorial laws. So while the federal government can propose solutions, it's ultimately up to the provinces and territories to put them into practice. This type of intergovernmental cooperation on housing is not unprecedented, though. For example, over the course of 20 years after it was introduced by the federal government, the National Building Code was adopted by every province and territory as a standard for building design and construction. Next slide, please. To help inform the development of a really strong and robust Renters' Bill of Rights, CCHR developed a series of recommendations in consultation with housing advocates and tenant leaders across the country. Our recommendations were grounded in 3 core principles. First, the Renters' Bill of Rights must take a human rights-based approach, meaning that it reflects Canada's commitment to implement the right to housing and is complemented with actions and investments that recognize housing as a human right rather than an investment vehicle. Second, it must include strong enforcement and accountability mechanisms to ensure that renters benefit from all protections both in law and in practice. And third, all renters must be afforded equal protections under the Renters' Bill of Rights. Building on these core principles, we developed a series of recommendations that reflect the elements of the right to housing, as well as the principles of equity, equality, and access to justice. For affordability, we emphasize that housing costs should reflect household incomes and should not interfere with renters' ability to enjoy other human rights like food. Rent increases should be moderate and predictable throughout and between tenancies through strong rent regulation. For security of tenure, we highlighted that eviction should always be treated as a last resort. In connection to location, we also recommended that rental agreements shouldn't end if renters have to leave their homes for renovations or repairs, except by consent, and that they should be provided with adequate accommodation or compensation until they can return. For habitability and services, we called for measures to ensure landlords maintain rental homes in a state of good repair, while ensuring renters have access to all necessary services and that they're safe from health, structural, and other hazards. For accessibility and cultural adequacy, we called for renters to have access to housing that meets their needs, including as it relates to the accessibility needs of people with disabilities, as well as the needs of renters from Indigenous, Black, newcomer, and other equity-deserving communities. For equity and equality, we emphasize that renters on both an individual and systemic level should be free from discrimination, harassment, and other threats, both in seeking and maintaining their housing. And for access to justice, we highlighted that renters should have access to strong enforcement and accountability mechanisms that account for the inherent power imbalance between renters and landlords. You can find more about our recommendations on our website, and we'll follow up to share the link with participants afterwards. Next slide, please. So in the absence of government-led consultations over the summer, CCHR surveyed tenant groups and housing organizations from across Canada, collecting their input on our recommendations for the Renters' Bill of Rights. The vast majority of respondents strongly endorsed our recommendations, and provided additional context on the importance of strong renter protections and actions that governments could take to implement them. The survey results reflected the need for a comprehensive suite of renter protections with robust accountability and enforcement mechanisms, including strong rent regulation and protection against eviction, especially around rent evictions, clear standards and definitions of affordability, habitability, accessibility, and cultural adequacy, funding to support landlord compliance with habitability standards, and accommodations for accessibility and cultural adequacy to ensure costs are not downloaded onto renters. Strong anti-discrimination laws to cover all protected human rights grounds, including prohibiting discriminatory screening practices to select renters. A public database of rental housing ownership, rent prices, property conditions, maintenance requests, and compliance. Legal support for renters, including accessible channels to report issues without fear of retaliation. Clear, accessible information about landlord and renter rights and responsibilities, including education and training. Well-resourced tribunals to investigate, monitor, and enforce landlord compliance, including timely dispute resolution, regular inspections, and strong penalties for violations. Measures to address the financialization of housing, including greater investments in non-market housing and limits on investment properties, and an annual review of the Renters' Bill of Rights to evaluate its effectiveness. While respondents were overwhelmingly supportive of strong renter protections across the country, some also expressed skepticism around the likelihood of their provincial or territorial government actually adopting or enforcing these protections. And that's a really key part of what we want to tackle today: how to hold the federal government accountable to ensure provinces and territories will uphold these critical protections. Next slide. So for its part, the federal government released the Renters' Bill of Rights blueprint this past September. The blueprint outlines a range of important measures that aim to improve fairness, equality, access, and affordability for renters, including protections against excessive rent increases and forced evictions, proportionality in renting practices, for example, considering fairness and timing around rent increases, evictions, and other issues, continued tenancies in the event of a unit change, renter relocation assistance in cases of displacement, accessible rental information, measures to address discrimination, standards for rental housing quality, compulsory landlord training, shifting the onus of proof to landlords to end tenancy agreements, legal support and education for renters, and improved tribunal processes and authority to impose substantial penalties. Importantly, the blueprint is framed around the shared responsibilities of federal, provincial, and territorial governments to advance the right to housing through strong renter protections, along with investments in non-market affordable housing. Next slide, please. So while there are some promising elements in the federal Renters' Bill of Rights blueprint, which do reflect feedback that CCHR and other tenant advocates shared, it also has some critical gaps. First, it does not include strong rent regulation provisions around rent control and vacancy control. These are both key policy levers to protect existing affordability in the rental market and security of tenure for renters, and have been a key focus of tenant advocacy across the country. The second key gap is around enforcement. It's encouraging that the federal government is using its new Canada Housing Infrastructure Fund as an incentive for provinces and territories to adopt elements of the Renters' Bill of Rights, along with some reporting requirements. However, the blueprint does not include strong enforcement mechanisms that would require provinces and territories to adopt all elements of the Renters' Bill of Rights. And lastly, the blueprint does not adequately contend with the fact that renter protections look very different in different parts of the country. In some provinces, like Ontario and Manitoba, for example, many of the protections outlined in the Renters' Bill of Rights blueprint may already exist in law but are not properly enforced, or specific legislative changes may be needed to strengthen renter protections in those jurisdictions. However, in other parts of the country, like Alberta and New Brunswick, for example, significant legislative changes are needed to adequately protect renters, as well as substantial investments in the infrastructure required to uphold those rights and ensure access to justice. So this could include funding for functional tribunals that deal with landlord and tenant issues and human rights issues as well. Next slide, please. So to be sure, there will be a long road ahead to implement a strong Renters' Bill of Rights across the country. We hope today's event serves as a starting point to build awareness and mobilize communities to advocate for a Renters' Bill of Rights that advances and protects the right to housing for all renters. For our part, we're very excited to continue this work, including by working closely with community partners who are leading key advocacy and mobilization efforts on the ground. We're also developing additional resources to support advocacy on renters' rights and protections with all levels of government. Finally, the federal government has signaled that the Renters' Bill of Rights is a living document with opportunities for it to evolve based on consultation with all levels of government, organizations, and tenants. We will be watching closely and continuing to push for public consultations to build on the current Renters' Bill of Rights and ensure that it truly reflects the experiences of renters across the country. Thanks so much. And with that, I'll pass it back to you, Taka, to introduce our panelists.
Thank you so much, Sarah. So as we're getting the presentation set up here, I'm very pleased to introduce our first panelist, Tanya Burkhart from ACORN Canada, who will be speaking to issues of affordability and displacement. So Tanya, you could, okay, there you are. Great. I'll pass it over to you now, Tanya.
Thanks, Utaka. Hello, everyone. My name is Tanya Burkhart, and I'm a member of ACORN Canada. My focus will be on affordability and displacement. Next slide, please. ACORN stands for Association of Community Organizations for Reform Now. We're a multi-issue membership-based community union of low and moderate income people, and we believe that social and economic justice is best achieved by building community power for change. We have 177,000 plus members organized into 32 neighborhood chapters in 10 regions across 6 provinces. Our daily perspective comes from direct tenant contact through door knocking, outreach, and community action. Next slide, please. Some promising aspects that ACORN finds in the Renters' Bill of Rights when it speaks to affordability and displacement are rental assistance programs such as rent banks and protection against market instability and against excessive rent increases. So those are the things that can result in displacement for tenants. Rental housing options that accommodate a diverse range of needs, such as students, families, seniors, Indigenous people, and persons with disabilities. We look forward to the creation of long-term, affordable, and non-market rental housing stock. We think that's important. And standards for lease agreements and consistent processes for background checks and providing receipts for rent paid or held in trust. Next slide, please. Making renting information available, accessible, and uniform. We look forward to landlords knowing what their title to the property is, legal agent, rental history, rental pricing, the state of repair in the buildings, or government managed platforms. Establishing mechanisms to track and publicly report on filings to increase rent or evict tenants, including the reasons for such actions. It's important to track rent evictions and evictions for sure. Protections against forced evictions, making sure that tenancy is continued in the event of a change to a unit, relocation assistance where required, and housing that contains basic health and safety standards. Next slide, please. Establishing and upholding formal processes for addressing complaints in a timely and accessible manner, closing loopholes, such as implementing rent increases prior to above guideline approval, strengthening mediation and alternative resolution mechanisms, and shifting the onus to property owners for providing proof to end tenancy agreements and providing legal aid or representation to even the playing field for renters. Granting tribunals and commissions the authority to impose substantial penalties to deter future offenses against bad actors, and implementing meaningful deterrents to bad faith actors who repeatedly engage in misconduct. Next slide, please. What's missing? There's a lot missing when it comes to guaranteeing affordability and stopping displacement. Rent control is obviously the largest piece of legislation that impacts affordability and displacement. So rent control legislation that includes full vacancy control, a ban on additional rent increases and limits on rent prices. Many provinces don't have any rent control at all. ACORN members in Alberta are getting $1,000 rent increases, and it results in them being displaced. There's a ban on fixed-term leases. In Nova Scotia, ACORN's recent survey shows how fixed-term leases are impacting and displacing tenants. Lack of enforcement mechanisms to actually make the renter's Bill of Rights a reality. And by lack of enforcement, how do you get provinces to be compliant in making sure that there is full rent control? And tenants are facing retaliation by their landlords for taking actions and demanding their rights. The right to organize is critical and it needs to be protected and enforced. Next slide, please. These photographs are from 3 buildings owned by Golden Equity. And on National Housing Day on November 22nd, we will be in the building in the second photograph demanding maintenance and safe and habitable conditions from the landlord Golden Equity. Golden Equity also owns the other 2 buildings given in these photographs. There's 99 Kennedy, 501 and 503 Balmoral, and 51 McMurtry. All of these buildings have the same landlord, and they're the same across the board in terms of condition. Next slide, please. How do we enforce the Renters' Bill of Rights? The federal government must require provinces and territories to sign bilateral agreements with the federal government, just like early childcare agreements and pharmacare agreements, to access funding for housing, such as the $5 billion Canada Infrastructure Fund and other federal program funding. Provinces and territories must be required to submit annual reports, and the funding needs to be contingent on how provinces and territories are progressing in enhancing tenant protections and working towards realizing the human right to housing. Action plans must be submitted to access future funding. Next slide, please. ACORN's demands are to set national tenants' rights standards and require provinces and territories to meet these standards as part of the Renters' Bill of Rights. We need a national lease structure, rent control with no loopholes, a ban on fixed-term leases. You can just give me the next slide, please. We need federal money to core housing, those in core housing need, rather than having developers build luxury rentals that are unaffordable. We need more non-market housing. We need the right to organize. We need landlord disclosure and contact information. And we need the federal government to meet with tenant groups regularly to review the effectiveness on an annual basis. Next slide, please. Thank you to Bhumika Jam for preparing this presentation. And I'll turn this session back to you, Taka.
Thank you so much, Tanya. And thank you for sort of grounding this in the experiences of renters. And to everyone, we'll have a chance to have a discussion at the end, but I wanted to let everyone know that there are a lot of actions happening, like the one that Tanya just described, coming up in the next couple of days around National Housing Day, in particular to calling for more federal funding for social housing and rent-to-income housing to address the housing crisis, in addition to some of the rights that we're talking about today. But I'll have a chance to share some more information about that later. So I just want to now introduce our next speaker, which is Nicoletta Ordelli from Spinal Cord Injury Ontario and the Accelerating Accessibility Coalition, who will be presenting on accessibility and cultural adequacy issues. Over to you, Nicoletta.
Hello, everyone. Thanks for having me today. My name is Nicoletta. I work for a provincial organization called Spinal Cord Injury Ontario. And I'm here representing the Accelerating Accessibility Coalition today, which SCIO is a founding member of. And my focus today will be accessibility. Next slide, please. So just to give you an idea of some of the current challenges that are happening in the accessibility space with regards to housing is that first and foremost, there is not enough accessible housing in the country. A lot of what we're seeing is that many people with disabilities are forced to live in long-term care because they simply have nowhere to go. And this is something that we see a lot of, especially in my line of work. A lot of our community members at SCIO, after they get injured, are stuck in rehab for a long time or have to live in hospital like settings because there's just not enough housing. Wait lists for supportive housing or rent year to income housing is extremely long, and yeah, a lot of the time people are waiting decades, so that's certainly not ideal. And there's also not enough support and resources to make the changes to a home that might make it accessible. So for instance, a lot of the times, yeah, even if you're just renting a place, making it accessible might not be that challenging. You might not have to be, ripping out walls and making tremendous changes. Sometimes it's as simple as installing an automatic button for the entrance, having a door opener, having grab bars in the bathroom, little things like that. But even with that, there isn't enough support to make things accessible and to make tweaks and changes. Many people with disabilities are living in precarious and unsafe situations where they are facing homelessness or they're injuring themselves because they're not in an appropriate home. And I'll give you an example. Sometimes a home might be barrier-free on paper, but the person who lives in that home might still be unsafe because it's not set up for their specific needs. I interviewed a gentleman just recently who lives in an accessible home, but he's injuring himself a lot because he's constantly bumping into the counter, which is inappropriate. It's not at an appropriate height for him. So he's he's been hospitalized and he's burned himself, and so that's very scary. And we also have people who are facing homelessness because they can no longer afford the climb in rent, so they have nowhere to go. So even if their current place is accessible, they, if they can no longer afford it, they will have to leave. And we also have people who for instance, I interviewed a lady recently who is dragging her walker up and down multiple flights of stairs, but she cannot afford to go anywhere else. So we're seeing a lot of these unsafe situations. At absolute worst, we're seeing people who are opting for medical assistance in dying because there's just not enough support. The vast majority of new homes just don't work for people with disabilities. And this is a major issue because we know that this is a growing population. There are a lot more seniors now. And, just fun fact, anybody can become disabled at any given time. So it may not seem like it, but this is a challenge that affects everybody. You may not need accessible housing today, but anything can happen. And there are always disabilities that, that people acquire, whether those are permanent or more temporary. Next slide, please. So the Accelerating Accessibility Coalition has been around since 2022, and it's the first of its kind. It contains a lot of disability organizations across the country, and as well as the real estate community and developers. And the Urban Land Institute in Toronto is serving as the AAC secretariat. And we're growing. We are now at 69 members, and we hope that this continues to grow. Next slide, please. We have something that's called the Accessibility Toolbox, and you can find this on our website. I'll make sure that that is shared afterwards. but it essentially contains, things that developers can use if they want to build more accessible homes or more accessible spaces in general. And it highlights, the work and best practices that the coalition, has put together. And one thing that I just want to share is that if you have a resource that that might be beneficial, I encourage you to share that. Linda's email is shared in this slide deck. She's lovely and approachable, and I'm sure that she would love to hear from you if there's something that you could recommend for the toolbox. This is a collaborative effort. We're all working together and learning together. So if you have a resource, let us know because we would love to make that available if possible. Next slide, please. Some things that are in the accessibility toolbox so far include a well-known app called Access Now. You may have heard of it. It's an app that allows people to rate public spaces and let people know how accessible those are, what features they have. Accessibility Standards Canada has shared some resources on how we can create more accessibility in the built environment, as well as accessible dwellings and public spaces, like using a bank machine that's, for instance, a person with a wheelchair or a person who has like a vision disability. In general, how can we make the space more accessible? So I encourage you to have a look at this, and again, let us know if there are resources that you can add to this as well. Next slide, please. Some of the activities that the coalition takes on is conducting tours in public about accessible housing spaces so that we can share those best practices. As well as sharing lived experience stories of real people in the community. So for instance, what are the challenges people are facing and what are some of the positive stories, because those exist as well. So that's just a little bit about the coalition, and thank you, and I look forward to any questions afterwards if there are any.
Thank you, Nicoletta. And I'm sure there will be lots of questions about how the Renters' Bill of Rights can support accessibility and the needs of people with disabilities. So my next presentation is Gael Boucher-Radway from the National Association of Friendship Centers, who will be presenting on the challenges and opportunities facing urban Indigenous renters. So over to you, Gael.
Good morning, or good morning or good afternoon to everyone. I wanted to thank the Canadian Centre for Housing Rights for inviting the NAFC to participate in this panel. I'd also like to apologize in advance as I am in the process of recovering from the flu. Next slide. Before we start with the presentation, I would like to start off by introducing myself. As mentioned, my name is Gael Boucher-Radway, and I work at the National Association of Friendship Centers as the Senior Research Coordinator. And I have the honor and privilege to be calling from the traditional unceded territory of the Algonquin Anishinaabe Nation. Next slide, please. So the National Association of Friendship Centers, also known as the NAFC, is a network of friendship centers and PTAs, provincial territorial associations, which make up part of the Friendship Center movement, also known as the FCM. Next slide, please. As mentioned, the Friendship Center movement is comprised of friendship centers and PTAs. There are over 100 friendship centers and PTAs coast to coast to coast, with their collective work reaching millions of points of contact in a year and hundreds and thousands of people every single day, offering programs and services ranging from mental health, culture, youth, justice, just to name a few. Next slide, please. So with respect to housing, here's a glimpse of the amazing supports and services that have been or are currently being offered by friendship centers. Examples of these supports include transitional housing, tiny homes, shelters, providing clothing and equipment, food banks, just to name a few. And these supports also shed light on the importance of the continuous advocacy for wraparound services when providing housing and homeless supports. Next slide, please. So I wanted to provide a quick snapshot of the gaps and barriers experienced by urban Indigenous communities when accessing housing supports and services through an intersectional lens. Systemic racism and anti-Indigenous racism emerges as one of the most significant barriers shaping how supports are tailored and implemented. So with respect to health, for example, this looks at the whole person and their well-being. Unfortunately, there aren't enough mental health, physical health, and substance use supports within the housing sector available for urban Indigenous communities. With respect to gender, some regions don't have enough supports for members of the 2S LGBTQIA plus community for urban Indigenous men or women. And this can also tie in with people escaping from abusive homes and not having the support system and the resources available to them for relocation, whether permanent or temporary. With respect to age and stages of life, for example, for urban Indigenous youth, not all regions have the same capacity to support youth, specifically on housing and homelessness. And there have also been conversations regarding having more transitional supports and resources for kids that are aging out of the foster care system. So specifically surrounding the barriers that youth members experience when attaining housing and the difficulty of navigating that. So that ties in with the inaccessible processes when putting in even an application for an apartment. And when looking at the experiences of elders and seniors, there are not enough supports available for elders and seniors, or even housing programs that are tailored to the specific needs of elders and seniors, as well as seniors and elders being seen as a support system when addressing housing and homelessness, taking in family members that are experiencing precarious housing or homelessness due to being denied from the shelters. Again, by kind of going with an intersectional lens when assessing the gaps, when providing services, this really emphasizes the importance of looking at the whole person when talking about housing, because it's not simply about putting a roof over one's head, but being able to sustain a home. Next slide, please. So on the topic of renting, I wanted to share a few of the narratives and insights that we have received throughout the past few years from friendship centers. And for the sake of time, I will be focusing on what was shared by friendship centers located in British Columbia. So for this slide, this is kind of like showcasing their reflections on the current state of the housing market and how that has impacted their communities. So there's a quote here: "Many homes are on the market for sale due to the increased market. This has left very high populations homeless and not able to find other places to rent." Another quote: "Landlords are seeing the houses they rent, landlords are selling the houses they rent because the properties are selling for a very high price, and rent has gone up greatly, from some rents being as high as $1,700 a month." Next slide, please. And as mentioned, taking an intersectional lens when assessing gaps and barriers experienced by urban Indigenous communities when acquiring housing, they have also mentioned how this has impacted youth and elders and senior community members. So there's a quote here that speaks on, "With the rising cost in rent, many of our elders are living in their vehicles and often the first to come into the center when we open our doors. Many families and individuals faced discontinued notices and risk of loss of utilities. We are able to help, but many continue to struggle with the effects of COVID-19, high rent, and low income." And I think that this is also important to note how COVID-19 has impacted housing in the homelessness sector, but also the impact of the sunsetting funds that were provided during the COVID-19 pandemic. So looking at how the additional support allowed many organizations like friendship centers to continue to provide support during the pandemic, but also reflecting on the impacts of no longer having this type of funding readily available to them now. Next slide, please. And then we have this slide right over here that speaks on the experiences and not having those certain key documents like a reference or even a credit check, for example, and how that can really derail someone's chances of having a home. So, for example, my experience when working with youth, where in an independent living program, there are a lot of systemic barriers that are practices just by our community that it really make it hard for young people or a young person to find affordable housing. Next slide, please. So when looking at the Renter's Bill of Rights, as promising as it may look, it is important to ensure that there is an accountability mechanism that is being sought for to ensure that the bill is being implemented, as well as more partnerships and long-term funding being made available to support Indigenous organizations that have the experience and the expertise to really address the needs of urban Indigenous communities, for example, when it comes to housing. Next slide, please. Thank you so much for listening to my presentation, and please be sure to support your local Friendship Center.
Thank you, Gael. And for our final presentation, I'd like to welcome Michelle Dis from the National Right to Housing Network, who will be presenting on systemic discrimination and access to justice. So I'll pass it over to you, Michelle.
Thanks so much, Yutaka. Thank you so much as well for the invitation to join this panel. I get the sense within our network that there's a lot of folks who are really hungry for a discussion about what the Renter Bill of Rights actually is and how it can affect the way that we protect renters. So I'm so excited for this panel today. Before I begin, I wanted to give a little bit of background on the National Right to Housing Network. And to tell the story of the National Right to Housing Network, I have to backtrack a little bit in history back to 2019. What I want you to know is in 2019, we got Canada's very first articulation of right to housing legislation. We got the National Housing Strategy Act, which creates roles like a federal housing advocate, National Housing Council, and really importantly, review panels, which are these 3-person panels who hold hearings on systemic violations of the right to housing. What we do at the National Right to Housing Network is we very much think of ourselves as the connective tissue across the housing justice movement. We are a network of over 2,000 organizations and individuals who are dedicated to realizing the progressive realization of the right to housing in Canada because we have this National Housing Strategy Act legislation. Folks who might be following the right to housing in Canada will know we've had these review processes over the last couple of years. And we can see, I think, some direct lines in some ways between stuff that's happened with the Federal Housing Advocate National Housing Council Review Panel and some of the policies that are in place. So, for example, Federal Housing Advocate did a review on the issue of encampments earlier this year, and then we saw in the federal budget a big commitment of $250 million around encampments. We're not talking about encampments today. We are talking about the Renter Bill of Rights, but I just give that as a bit of an illustration. There was also a financialization review panel that happened last year. I can see who's in here, and I know some of you, in fact, made submissions to that financialization review panel, and we can see a direct line between that right to housing legislation and the start of this Renter Bill of Rights. So we at the National Right to Housing Network, we sit at the center of the right to housing movement, connecting people to those right to housing mechanisms and helping make it real and meaningful. There is a QR code. This is not the first time, or not the last time rather, that I will shamelessly plug that folks should sign up for our newsletter if they want to learn a little bit more about the National Right to Housing Network and the National Housing Strategy Act and the right to housing mechanisms that have come out with that. Could I have the next slide, please? This is the slide that I like to call my overwhelming word slide. There's a lot of boxes on this slide, so bear with me for a second. If you take away anything from this presentation that I'm giving now, it's not even necessarily directly about the Renter Bill of Rights, but it is that the right to housing is not just a rallying cry. It's not just something that we put on our posters and advocate for. I mean, it certainly is, but the right to housing is also a legal standard. It is based in international human rights law, and we are accountable to international human rights law mechanisms, things like the Committee on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights. We have UN authorities like the UN Special Rapporteur on the right to adequate housing. And then we also have these mechanisms in Canada, like a National Housing Council, like the Federal Housing Advocate, like a review panel. And all of these mechanisms inform the policies that are released by the Minister of Housing, Infrastructure, and Communities Canada, currently Minister Sean Fraser. Could I have the next slide, please? I know that was so quick. I always hear feedback that that is a lot of words on a slide, and I do it really quickly. So I think we're going to be sending out the slides later. And again, if you want to learn more about the National Housing Strategy Act, we have a newsletter, and I will make sure that that goes into our chat. So, for much of my discussion, I am really zeroing in on this question of discrimination in housing and access to justice. So, I come to you today. I am a human rights lawyer. I am coming to you from the unceded traditional territory of the Algonquin Anishinaabe people. I am by trade an Ontario trained lawyer. I have represented clients. I have done tenant duty counsel. I'm sure that we have a lot of legal representatives in this call as well who have seen many of these things firsthand, seen the ways that discrimination can play out within tenancies. So much of my frame of reference is as an Ontario lawyer, but I have also heard from so many colleagues across the country about gaps in existing systems that really perpetuate discrimination in housing. So something that I will flag for folks is that there's ways, for example, in Ontario, where you have something like a Residential Tenancies Act that governs the relationship between landlords and tenants. You also have a human rights code. And sometimes what gets missing from the discussion is that landlords have an obligation to ensure that they are not discriminating against tenants. And we have these things called prohibited grounds of discrimination within human rights codes. So landlord can't discriminate against a tenant based on grounds, and I use the Ontario list, but it is quite similar in other provinces and territories, based on grounds like color, ethnic origin, ancestry, place of origin, citizenship, or creed is the language within the legislation. And in some provinces and territories, they actually say that landlords can't discriminate based on a tenant. So discrimination looks like something like maybe denying a tenant a unit. It could look like something like evicting a tenant based in discriminatory reasons or treating them unfairly. And I will flag that the provinces of Quebec, the territory of the Northwest Territories, New Brunswick, have protection that landlords cannot discriminate to tenants based on grounds of social condition. Manitoba and Newfoundland and Labrador have something similar. But all this to say, social condition is the way that you might be experiencing poverty, for example. We also know that discrimination runs so deep within landlord-tenant relationships. So, a statistics folks might be familiar with is that 93% of Black real estate agents believe that discrimination plays a role in the rental process in Ontario. And the other really big issue is that when a tenant or a prospective tenant faces discrimination, where do they go? What do you do? Who do you call? What legal representative do you call? And in fact, some folks on the call might know this more than others, but for example, Ontario has a really robust legal clinic system that often supports tenants in landlord-tenant matters. They might not support tenants, though, when they face discrimination and it's a human rights code violation. But most provinces and territories across the country have nothing. No legal services, no tenant duty counsel, no legal clinic that you call. And I think we've had this discussion, as the Renter Bill of Rights was being created, where do you go if you're a tenant who is being evicted? And so this, I think, was a major part of the discussions we had with the government around the Renter Bill of Rights. When we get to the question and answer period, I'm going to probably talk a fair bit about the Tenant Protection Fund as well, which is all about funding for legal services and tenant organizing. And I will wrap up there.
Thank you so much, Michelle. And thank you to all our panelists. So just going to wait for Sarah to switch the display. And so now we're going to have a sort of a brief discussion with all of our panelists. So I would invite Gael, Michelle, Nicoletta, and Tanya to turn on your cameras so that everyone can see you. And I want to pose a question to all of you. Some of you already covered this in your presentations. Some of you may want to elaborate on what you said or add to something. But one of the first questions we wanted to pose was, what elements in the current RBR, Renters Bill of Rights, do you find particularly promising to address some of the concerns that are motivating the people that you work with or represent? And then sort of how could they uphold the right to housing for renters? So I don't know if anyone wants to jump in. We've got about 20 minutes for this discussion, and then we'll move to answering some of the questions that have been posed by our attendees. Michelle?
Thanks, Yutaka. I can jump right in because it goes really directly connected with my presentation there. The piece that I might touch upon for folks lives not in the Renter Bill of Rights, but adjacent to the Renter Bill of Rights, which is the Tenant Protection Fund. So in addition to the Renter Bill of Rights, the federal government also promised $15 million over a period of 5 years for tenant organizing and also for research and policy solutions that support the rights of renters. As folks might know, decisions, I think, for funding for a lot of folks, I don't think that they're out there. I haven't heard from anyone within the network who has heard back yet. But that said, I think that this part about investing in tenant organizing is really substantial. Doesn't go a very long way. I think it'll probably only play out to be like $3 million a year, which isn't much. And important to also contrast this with the fact that we actually had a funding program for tenant organizing called the Community-Based Tenant Initiative back in 2017 in the original National Housing Strategy. And that got cut in March, I think, of last year, if I'm not mistaken. But there is this funding piece of this that kind of like, in my mind, is very much attached onto the Renter Bill of Rights that I think is an important part of our, the more positive parts of the Renter Bill of Rights that could be built upon to be more effective.
Thanks for that, Michelle. Tanya?
I think the most promising aspect would be rent control. I think it's the single one thing that impacts affordability and security of tenure. It's also a really important aspect of blunting the financialization of housing. The financialization of housing hasn't really been addressed in the Renters Bill of Rights. It's addressed in other ways, but it doesn't, there's no real application to stop it. And so full rent control across all provinces and territories, that means vacancy control, a ban on above guideline increases, a ban on no fault evictions, fixed term leases, and any kind of loophole that a landlord could use to get around full rent control, I think would be an amazing tool. And it has to go across Canada, all provinces and territories, and that could be done through a bilateral agreement for sure.
I can chime in next.
Great.
And again, echoing the sentiments of my fellow panelists. I would like to specifically highlight the element that focuses on addressing inequality and discrimination, as mentioned in the Renters Bill of Rights, outlining the importance of looking at identifying and addressing the discriminatory practices based on factors such as race, family composition, and even like pet ownership. anti-Indigenous racism is a significant barrier to accessing affordable housing and even sustaining that housing. So with rent practices often being really inaccessible due to systemic racism deeply embedded in them. So it's promising to see the recognition of these discriminatory practices and the commitment to taking an action to eradicating them and combing through and identifying all these regulations and practices that have been discriminatory in the past and updating it so that it is reflective of a, I guess, better future. But then I think that also ties in with the element of what they call like fostering fairness and transparency as well. So making sure that all this information is available and accessible and really outlining who is responsible for what so that we don't have to navigate through that confusion as well. Thanks.
Great, thanks, Gail. And I note that some of the people in the questions have sort of talked about their personal experience with discrimination. So it is an important piece. Nicoletta?
Yeah, I would just say that there's an element of affordability that's really highlighted. So that's great to see because, you know, in the communities that we serve, you can't talk about accessibility without talking about affordability. The two go hand in hand. And we know that the disability population is prone to living below the poverty line. So it's a huge, huge barrier. So that's one thing I'm definitely happy to see in there.
Great, thanks, Nicoletta. So the second question that we came up with is related to the first, you know, like what were the promising things? Then of course, what's missing? So what should have been in there, and what isn't? I know some of you did talk about that in your presentations, but I don't know if anyone wants to jump in and talk about how specifically the RBR, the Renters' Bill of Rights, can be improved.
I can go first.
Great, thank you.
So I guess the missing thing would be funding, and even more funding being available to support wraparound services to ensure that folks are able to stay at home, but also engaging with folks with lived experiences to have a better understanding of how funding should be spent as well. So again, like securing long-term funding to support Indigenous organizations like Friendship Centers as they kind of continue to support their communities, which can then further strengthen and enrich the Renters' Bill of Rights. And then again, an accountability mechanism. So when asking the question, how do we measure the successes or even the lessons learned from this Renters' Bill of Rights? So with the feedback that we've heard in the past from Friendship Centers, the jurisdictional wrangling has really resulted in a lot of confusion surrounding who should be overseeing the funding and managing affordable housing programs and services. And this has resulted in a lot of gaps when attempting to deliver services and programs. However, you know, Friendship Centers have been able to kind of use their creativity and resiliency to provide support, but it shouldn't be a guessing game, and everything should be really clear and concise in that sense. Thanks.
Yeah. Anyone else? Nicoletta, Michelle, Tanya, want to jump in on this one? Go for it, Michelle.
I'm happy to jump in. I'm looking at Nicoletta and Tanya to see if they wanted to. Okay. But just to jump in here, what's missing? I want to show like huge amplify on the point of vacancy control. If I could answer that in 2 words, vacancy control is missing from this. You'll see in the Renter Bill of Rights, there's this reference to Tanya might know the language better than I do, and I don't have it in front of me, but it's like something like egregious increases by landlords in rent. Like there's some kind of vague language, but they don't actually come out and say vacancy control is the answer. They also don't talk about rent control as well. And I also want to support the other panelists in the point of, you know, what does this lack? Well, this lacks teeth. You know, like this is going to be up to all of us. It's going to be up to tenant organizers. It's going to be up to advocates to actually enforce this and keep the provinces and territories accountable to following the Renter Bill of Rights, and doing the things on that list in order to get the infrastructure funding. So what is missing is accountability and then a specific articulation around vacancy control and a specific articulation around rent control. From my perspective, though, that isn't an insurmountable thing. I feel like there's a lot of really strategic work that we can do to push the federal government to be more particular, to be more clear about what their expectations are. And I think especially with the hopefully the increase in capacity from the tenant organizing movement, we can push back on implementation and make some of these commitments more tangible.
Great. Tanya, were you going to respond?
I just wanted to support what Michelle had said. Vacancy control is a complex issue. There's a lot of components that go into rent control. Vacancy control is absolutely one measure. If you remember the photograph, the second photograph in the slide presentation was of a building. And as I was flyering that building in August and September, I'm putting flyers on the same day they're receiving a 5.5% above guideline rent increase. And so not only do they have the 2.5 provincially mandated percentage, they have a 5.5 for 8%. And so you've seen the conditions in the photograph in the building, and then you realize that a lot of things need to happen in rent control. It's not just vacancy control, it's a ban on above guideline rent increases or additional rent increases. And the increases that tenants receive every year, they need to be capped. So tenants in Alberta shouldn't receive $500 increases. Tenants in New Brunswick shouldn't be receiving $300 rent increases or the end of their fixed term lease. And so rent control is a very complex issue. There's a lot that goes into that for sure. And that's why it's so, so important to have that rent control enforced in a bilateral agreement. If the federal government can do it for pharmacare and for affordable childcare, they can definitely do it for the Renters' Bill of Rights.
Nicoletta, do you want to add anything to the comments here?
Yeah, I would just say that I would like to see more in there about accessibility and people with disabilities. I didn't see that mentioned explicitly, and I think that's very important. And even though, in my work, we primarily deal with physical disabilities, that is not the only type of disability. There are lots of invisible disabilities and, other things that impact people as they age. So I think that needs to be in there more explicitly, just to ensure that there isn't that type of discrimination.
Great. And I know that some of you actually just touched on this, but our next question is, how can we make sure that this is enforceable? How can we ensure, and this is, based on some of the questions I've seen being posed by people today, how can we make sure that this actually gets enforced, given that a lot of these rights are provincial jurisdiction, and as we know from Tanya's presentation, some provinces and Michelle's presentation, there's some provinces that are really far behind others, even though we know across Canada we need an increase in renters' rights, regardless of how good the current provincial or territorial law is. So I don't know if anyone wants to take a stab at, what can we do or what can the government do, but then I think related, what can we do to make sure that this RBR becomes enforceable and also a reality? Well, I'm just gonna have to jump in here.
Taka, do you want me to put you out of your misery? Yeah.
Yes, please.
Um, okay, so a couple of things. The first thing I'm going to mention that is positive in the Renter Bill of Rights, that is something for us to watch, is that there's language in there that says that provinces and territories should report on their implementation annually. That might be a really interesting moment for us to advocate, to watch the enforcement. Maybe this looks like advocacy in provinces and territories on that annual reporting. I think overall, it's like, we have to make sure that this isn't it. Like this isn't our moment. Like we get the Renter Bill of Rights and okay, federal government puts up their hands, they're done, walk away slowly. Like it has a lot to do, I think, with that annual reporting. I also think I find increasingly in the work that I do with government, with advocates, with rights holders across the country, is that as much as we can, finding the ways to demonstrate the good practices to government, showing what those good practices are, and then attaching them onto the mechanisms that we've seen the federal government commit to within the Renter Bill of Rights, within the right to housing legislation, the National Housing Strategy Act. I'm thinking about, financialization was touched upon, for example, right? There's not much on financialization in this Renter Bill of Rights, but I think that there is some interest in things like what's happening in Toronto and Hamilton with the rent eviction bylaws that are passing. The more that we can communicate what those best practices or good practices are, and the more we can attach them on to what commitments exist, I think the more successful our advocacy will be to make the Renter Bill of Rights something that is more enforceable, both for us and for government. I'm also going to do a shameless plug for the National Right to Housing Network website, which is at housingrights.ca. And we have a great newsletter there if folks want to keep up to date on what we're doing on those pieces.
Thanks, Michelle. Did anyone else want to talk a bit about enforcement or sort of making this RBR, Renters Bill of Rights, to keep on turning it into an acronym, Renters Bill of Rights, enforceable?
I think maybe to quickly just chime in, I agree with what Michelle had mentioned, and further echoing the importance of having a proper accountability mechanism in place. And that could also include doing robust assessment of who are the current key players in the housing and homelessness and our even renting sector as well. And ensuring that information is continuously streamlined between federal, provincial, and municipal governments, along with these robust or with these key players and with these grassroots and community-led organizations, and then creating that collaboration, because if we don't know what's going on, we can't hold them accountable. And so information, I think, is powerful too.
I don't know if Tanya and Nicoletta want to pop in.
I think just ensuring that we're continuing to look at legislation, whether it's at the federal, the municipal, or provincial levels, just ensuring that the human right to housing, we're just really looking at legislation from that perspective, I think is important. Ensuring that we don't always look at the federal perspective, but we're also looking at municipal rent and replacement bylaws, rent eviction bylaws, which we're currently working on, and just ensuring that at every level of government, whatever we're advocating for, that it really comes from with that lens of the human right to housing, and ensuring that at the federal level, there is that reporting back and forth between the federal government and provinces about how are we progressing the human right to housing. And so I think that's just something to really watch out for in the legislation and the progress that's going to be made through the Renters Bill of Rights.
Thanks, Tanya. I don't know if you wanted to add anything to that, Nicoletta? Okay. Well, thanks so much for answering those questions. We have quite a few questions that have been posed through the Q&A. Some of us have tried to answer some of those through the Q&A function, so they would have appeared as text to answer some of those specific questions. But I'm gonna now hopefully pull out, because there are, like sometimes themes that people have been asking similar questions. So I may not get to the specific question that you've been asked. Hopefully in our discussion now we'll be able to get to most of the main things that people are concerned about and people are asking our panelists. So, one of the things that's come up a lot I've seen in the question and answer, the Q&A, is questions around what actions tenants can take when they have faced or are facing discrimination, displacement, or problems with their specific housing. So what can they do if they've been harassed, for example, after standing up for their rights? And I know that sometimes this is specifically based on the particular place where they are, based on different legislation, but I think there's also an opportunity here for some of you to speak about not just the legal responses and rights that people have, but actually what tenants can do when they to do that outside of those processes. So I know that was sort of leading the answer, but I don't know if Tanya or Michelle or Gael or Nicoletta want to answer what tenants can do when they're facing discrimination or when they are trying to stand up for their rights and facing hurdles when they're doing that. Tanya? Oh, you are muted, Tanya.
Okay, so organizing and talking to your neighbors, if you're in the same building together, it's a great way to expose and collectively organize. Sometimes there's more power in numbers. Absolutely know what your rights are. Making sure that you're advocating for yourself, whether it's through LTB processes at the provincial level, speaking out at city council regarding bylaws that may be relevant to you about renovictions, about anything that you're experiencing, and community action. I'm a huge supporter of community action. Just exposing what's going on, I think, is sometimes the best justice you can receive is social justice, and exposing something and just seeking justice collectively is a great strategy.
Thanks, Tanya. And I just want to pop in here and remind everyone that when Michelle was talking about how getting the National Housing Strategy Act and the recognition of the right to housing, that was undeniably a result of sustained years and years and years of tenants and people who are homeless and allies organizing across the country to press the government for a national housing strategy. And so we know that it can produce and does produce results. And it's a key part of ensuring that we do have a right to housing is that we have to stand up together and make sure that governments and landlords fulfill their obligations to the right to adequate housing. If anybody else wanted to jump in on this question of what to do around enforcing your rights.
I can jump in really quickly, Utaka. Yeah. So normally when I get this question, Tanya, I say, see if you have a local ACORN chapter and call them if you're facing this, because ACORN does. So just a shameless plug for ACORN. They do incredible organizing. If you're not following your local ACORN, you really should. The second thing I would say, if you're in the province of Ontario in particular, there is a really robust legal clinic system. So looking up what your legal aid clinic is in Ontario is always a really good strategic choice. And there's also some legal services available kind of in a patchwork across the country in other provinces and territories. But something I wanted to flag for folks, the National Housing Strategy Act gives us those mechanisms of a federal housing advocate and review panel I was talking about. The federal housing advocate has a website where you can make a submission if you see a systemic violation of the right to housing. If you're experiencing facing something that's systemic and you're a rights holder, or if you're an advocate, if you're an ally, you can make a submission to the Federal Housing Advocate. The other thing I'll plug is that there is a review panel that is that the terms of reference have been released for. I think more is about to come out soon, where there are these 3 members of the National Housing Council. They're doing a human rights-based review on the way the government has failed to prevent and eliminate homelessness for women, gender diverse persons, particularly Indigenous women and Two-Spirit persons, excuse me, and their experience of homelessness. So that review panel process is opening up fairly soon. So again, you can go to our website to learn more about that, but the National Housing Council will be releasing more information on that. And that's a really concrete, tangible way, make a written submission as a way to organize and push for more systemic solutions.
Okay, so we've got a few ideas here for what renters can do, what tenants can do: organize, talk to ACORN chapters, talk to legal clinics, talk to get involved in these processes. I don't know if Gael or Nicoletta have any other ideas of things that people can do.
I can quickly chime in. I guess, again, shameless plug, but speaking from the perspective of the National Association of Friendship Centers and Friendship Centers themselves, Friendship Centers do, not all, but some do have navigators that can kind of assist folks personally one-on-one when navigating experiences with housing or acquiring housing, or even whatever experiences they may currently be having with their landlords. And so there are a lot of supports like that, and they've even gone as far as engaging with the Office of Federal Housing Advocates to kind of shed more light. So I think leaning onto community and the community supports, as Tanya had mentioned, there is strength in numbers. And so there are supports and organizations, grassroots-led, Indigenous-led organizations that are there to also provide support in navigating these really tedious processes.
Yeah, and I would
Okay.
also emphasize just relying on community as much as possible. One of the things that I do in my role is I interview people who are having challenges, and we try to do as much storytelling as possible, because it's one thing to see data, numbers, things like that. When you actually hear about like a real human being who's going through these experiences, it can be very eye-opening. So we try to do as much storytelling as possible. And like I mentioned in my presentation, both the positive aspects and the negative.
Great, thanks. I noticed there's a couple questions in the Q&A around financialization. I know that Tanya, you mentioned it, but I don't know if anyone has anything to add about how the RBR could, or other policies that the federal government could introduce, could affect or sort of lessen the commodification, so the hyper commodification of housing that's occurred with financialization. Michelle.
I mean, yeah, we can talk about financialization. I love this question. And Tanya can as well. So I'll go fast. But financialization. So we had this review panel process. We got a report. The federal government released their response to that report. And there's not much in it. It's really a lot of it is a report of here's what we're doing already, and points to things like the Renter Bill of Rights, but the Renter Bill of Rights doesn't include much on financialization. Federal government also, though, in the budget committed to doing more on financialization, but they were really vague about what that looks like tangibly. I think that there is a really good appetite, though, to do more work on financialization, and something beautiful that I think that has come out of this human rights review panel process this past year is so many advocates and rights holders who made submissions that are so substantial and and important, that have some very tangible recommendations attached on, related to tax measures the federal government could take, related to regulation of private actors, connecting what's happening in Canada on financialization to what's happening globally, because we are not just happening, the financialization experience is not in a vacuum in Canada, it's happening in countries all around the world. So I think there's a lot that we can potentially pull out of that and maybe attach on to some of the commitments in the Renter Bill of Rights and certainly the National Housing Strategy Act, given that we've got this review panel process.
Great, thanks. Tanya?
I think you can't really solve, or I mean, to some degree, maybe you could solve, but I think truly the best mechanism for dealing with the financialization of housing is looking at where property owners, landlords, and corporations, where they make their money, and kind of slowing that down and eventually changing the legislation, closing the tax loophole that allows them to pay no tax, take that money, and then give it back to investors. And so there's a lot of things that can be done. The government has blatantly said they're not going to do that, but you can't solve the housing crisis unless you deal with the financialization of housing. Rent control does that to some respect. But if you're going to solve the supply issue, you're going to have to at some point deal with financialization. And how they do that, they haven't really given us a clear response. So that means dealing with rent evictions, vacancy control, rent control, the tax loopholes that make it extremely profitable, and for corporations to pay their fair share of tax. So I think there's a lot that can be done. Are they going to do that? Probably not, for corporate interest reasons. So eventually, over time, somebody is going to have to do something. Because no matter how much money you throw at it, these conditions will continue. And no matter how much legislation, landlords are always going to find a way around a rent eviction bylaw or rent control. So we would
Thanks.
definitely like to see financialization dealt with in the future for sure.
Yeah, thanks, Tanya. And we are sort of running out of time, and I'm sorry we didn't get to everyone's questions. We are keeping track of them, and they definitely, your comments and your questions are definitely going to inform CCHR's work on this issue moving forward. And I think one thing to keep in mind is that, like, you know, as poor as they are, the rights that tenants have, the human rights code, all of these things, they weren't always there, right? They were things that people who were facing discrimination, who were struggling against their landlords, like, organized and worked together to press their governments to make those things a reality. And I think it's, you know, unfortunately, it's still the struggle that we have to keep on being engaged in, to make sure that those rights are expanded, to make sure that the human right to housing is actually respected and realized by governments and by duty bearers across the country. But just hopefully, I want us to remember that, you know, like, things have moved in a good direction, and it's because of the work of so many people like us and so many people like you who've been doing this work for decades, for many years. So I just want to thank our excellent panelists, our French interpreters, and all of you for joining us today. So we will be sending out the slides and the recording of today's session to everyone, along with an evaluation survey, and with key takeaways in it, and a blog post that we'll be posting on National Housing Day. So if you have any feedback, we'd love to hear it, including, like, you know, what kind of things we should be doing in the future to ensure that the Renters' Bill of Rights truly does protect renters across Canada, and that we are moving towards the realization of the right to adequate housing in Canada. So we are, as I said, currently developing additional mobilization and advocacy resources to support your efforts across the country to hold the federal government accountable to improving that Renters' Bill of Rights. And of course, working with organizations like all of the ones on our panel today and others across the country to advance the right to housing in Canada. So with that and along with that, I just want to encourage everyone to support the Social Housing and Human Rights Campaign, which is organizing actions and events across the country this week. I think Tanya mentioned some things which are sort of linked to that campaign, which is calling on the federal government to immediately begin creating 50,000 new rent geared to income social housing units annually across Canada. You can find more information about that campaign by going to moresocialhousing.ca. And hopefully someone, because I don't think I'm able to post the chat, but hopefully someone can post that website on the chat, because there are a bunch of different events across the country. I know some of them may have taken place earlier this week, but I'm sure there's some tomorrow and on National Housing Day on Friday. Next slide. So, and thank you everyone for coming. In the meantime, just stay tuned, keep in touch. You can find us on social media, go to our website, learn more about our work and about the Renters' Bill of Rights there on the website. And I just want to thank you all again, thank our presenters again, our translators, for joining us today, and take good care.